All right, welcome to yet another chapter in our social problems class. All right, so chapter 5 is about sexual orientation. And so before I jump into the terms and other things, I just want to give you an overview of why we are talking about this. So to be sexually deviant is just to be sexually in a way that's different from the expectation or different from what is considered normal. And so this is going to include a lot of different groups: gay, lesbian people, asexual people, or people who don't have sexual desires. It includes transgender, but I told you that in my mind that's not really an appropriate place to put this because that's about gender and not about sexual orientation. But because they endure many of the same experiences, then they oftentimes get included in this group. And so while life is better for people who are a part of this group than it has been in the past, there's still a lot of kind of work that could be done to help them. So why are we talking about them in a social problems class? Well, life for members of this group, and I'm going to use a term that when I was 20 was a bad word, but it's become redefined, and that is queer. And this is just going to refer to anybody who is not not heterosexual, and also refer to people who identify as something other than the sex that they were assigned at birth. So kind of a generic term to categorize all of these people under kind of one term, and that's the term queer. And so for queer people in the United States, there are certain bad things that happen to them more often. So that's what kind of why it kind of happens here in this social problems section. And that is things like they're more often to have mental health problems. So if you look at suicide attempts or suicidal ideations, which is just thinking or planning about suicide, that's much more common among people who are a part of this group. And if you look at poverty, there's more poverty among gay people, or not gay people, queer people than other groups. They're less likely to be promoted at work. They're more likely to have issues with their families. They are more likely to be involved in the foster care system and also more likely to run away from the foster care system. They're more likely to be separated from their family of origin. They're the people who birth them or raise them. Oftentimes it's related to their sexual orientation that's causing these problems. And there's a couple of things that happen to gay and not gay people. I keep going back to that. In my mind, gay is sort of kind of a generic term for all queer people, but it's obviously not. Queer is a better term. It's just I have to get used to saying that word. And those are things like coming out of the closet, or this experience of telling the world, you know what, I assume that you probably thought I was one way, but the truth is that I am somewhere, I'm different, and I'm not apologizing for it, and I'm not going to change just because it makes you uncomfortable that I'm different. That's kind of what coming out of the closet is about. So let's kind of quickly define some of the terms here. What is sexual orientation? Well, our book says that it's a classification based around emotional and sexual relationships, lifestyles with people. I think probably the much better term is self-identity. People who identify as homosexual, or they identify as heterosexual, or identify as asexual. And because there's a lot of other factors that play in. There are people who have sex with people of the same sex who don't consider themselves gay, maybe like people in prison. Or there are people who, don't have sex because their partner passed on 10 years ago and they've never had another relationship because maybe they don't have a desire for sex. Maybe they're elderly. So I think probably it's just better and easier to think about it as just how people identify themselves. And that's going to be probably related to, you know, the way that they think about romance, or the way that they used to think about romance, or some sort of like internal identity that they have, right? So queer, here's that term that I used earlier, someone who falls outside of the norms surrounding gender and sexuality. About 4% of people identify, because see, there's my identification term there, they identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Gay rights have gotten better for people in the United States and the world compared to where they were 100 years ago. And in fact, the trend in the United States is toward the support of gay and lesbian individuals. I remember when the mayor of San Francisco began issuing marriage license, and I think this was about in 2003 or 2004, something like that. And there was a lot of conversation. It's kind of a nice way of putting it. But there were actually more people who were against allowing gay people to get married than who were for it. But support has changed since then, and some people say that it actually was the media. There was a show back during this time, a comedy called Will and Grace, and it was about a gay man that was Will, and Grace was his really funny off-color friend, and she and him were just a really funny, and it was very popular. It might have even been a #1 TV show at that time, and it was almost like having gay friends, you know, kind of come into your lives, come into your living rooms, and I know you weren't interacting with them, but you know, they were kind of, you got to see them play out. And so some people think that actually was the thing that pushed the needle toward more support. We have our four perspectives here, and they're going to look at this issue a little bit different and try to understand what's going on. Why is there an issue? Why are people who are queer treated differently than other groups? And so functionalists are going to say, you know what, like society works best when people stick to the roles that they were born with and the roles that facilitate reproduction. Right? And so that's going to be a marital union between a man and a woman. And if we don't outright ban everybody, then at least they're going to hold up the man and the woman as the ideal and say, all right, well, we're going to allow other people to do things differently, but we're going to stick with this is what the best thing is. Right? So, this is the idea of internalized heterosexuality, that this is the norm, this is what's best, this is what we should shoot for, this is what we should support as a nation, right? And so in the past, this was, you know, held up a lot higher and a lot more, it was considered a lot more healthy and what everyone should do. But realize that even back then, that not everybody would have done this. You know, there were people who would have been single their entire lives. You know, they would have been bachelors. I guess there was more support for men who were bachelors because we didn't allow women to do it without calling them, you know, spinsters at that time. And so, but since like the 1950s, I want to say 1950s, 1960s, this has kind of fallen out of fashion. Looking at it from the conflict and the feminist perspective, remember feminism, we talked about that, I think, a couple of chapters ago, and the third wave, there was a third wave that tried to extend freedoms and privileges to women who were queer. And so heterosexism, which is the idea that heterosexuality is normal and we should encourage everyone to be that, and it's okay if people who are not that are treated differently, are discriminated against. Right? And so how would this show up today, for instance? Well, you're going to have a hard time, say, you know, moving up in your job if you are, you know, if you're transgender, let's say, or if you're in a lesbian relationship. You know, being in leadership is going to be harder for people because of heterosexism. On the other hand, if you're heterosexual, you have some privileges because of your heterosexuality. You know, so, you know, for instance, most of our leaders, most of our, you know, people in the upper levels of management of large institutions, they're heterosexual. They're typically have usually have partners of the opposite sex, and they oftentimes have children, and so they're not having to think about like how are people going to interpret my sexuality? Are they going to hold that against me? Are they going to things like that? So it's sort of it's like white privilege in some ways. You're not having to think about it. All right, homophobia is I mean, like the definition, I guess, is a fear of same-sex relationships, but it is about prejudice and fear, intolerance of people who are gay. Oftentimes, specifically at gay men, gay women are oftentimes sexualized. And so, well, oftentimes they are sometimes sexualized by heterosexual men, and so there's oftentimes a less discrimination and prejudice toward those individuals. I think it's because of sexism. I think there's some sexism in there that says that men have to act this way, men have to dominate, and because gay men are not dominating women, it kind of goes against that. But I could be wrong there. Let's talk about some terminology, and that I find this really interesting. The term heterosexuality was invented in the late 19th century. So the late 1800s was when this idea of heterosexuality comes into being. And so kind of forget for a minute about sex per se. This is just about identity, how somebody identifies themselves. And so this term of being heterosexuality becomes an identity. Somebody then says, oh, I am this thing. Not that I'm doing something. I mean, it may be based upon what I'm doing, but we do a lot of things that we don't create identities around. So for instance, you know, like you eat lunch, and not everybody eats lunch, but you're not going to take on the identity of a lunch eater. Right? That sounds kind of silly, right? And so in the past, the identity of sleeping with somebody who was, or you know, who was of the opposite sex wouldn't have had an identity with it. And so I'm assuming that neither would have being, you know, sexual with someone of the same sex have an identity. It would have been a behavior. Obviously, that behavior has been around. But in terms of the identity, like I'm going to claim an identity that's based upon my attraction and my emotional relationships, or my desire for emotional sexual relationships. So, all right. One of the things that gay people do, not always, of course, but oftentimes it's part of being gay, if they're wanting to be known as being gay, is coming out. And coming out is about disclosing to other people the fact that their sexuality may be different from what other people's sexuality is. Or they're assumed, again, oftentimes we assume that people are heterosexual until we have other evidence. And that's part of that internalized heterosexuality that we talked about a few slides ago. And so, you know, where is somebody coming out of? They're coming out of a closet. You know, they're coming out of a closet of secrecy or yeah, secrecy. And I was going to say privacy, but the reality is being in the closet for most people that I know of, is not a good place. It's not a healthy place to keeping secrets and sharing with these people this thing and those people with that thing and trying to act one way in public but maybe different around a partner or someone that you're close with. And so coming out of the closet and saying, I identify as this, and this is who I am, and I am not afraid of who I am. And really, typically the response is, well, if you're confident that you are that, then I am also confident that you are that. And if you're going to treat yourself with respect regarding that thing, then I'm also going to return that to you as well. So, but it's not just a one-time thing. In fact, if you move to a new job, you may have to come out all over again. Every time you meet somebody new, potentially you have a coming out experience every time with that, whereas somebody who is heterosexual, again, there's sort of this internalized, this is what we assume people are, and so heterosexuals don't have to come out and say, oh, by the way, I'm heterosexual. All right, so being gay in the United States and in much of the West, much of the world actually, I'm trying to think like where would there not be discrimination toward gay people. The Native Americans didn't have much of a problem. They accepted it as kind of a normal part of life, and other indigenous peoples in like South America. But today, there are parts of Europe and other places where it's more accepted than it is here in the United States. But there are other places like the Middle East and North Africa where it's a capital offense to be gay. And so anyway, it's so there have been laws that have been passed to undermine gay and lesbian, queer relationships, and then there are other laws to protect people and their relationships, right? So starting in 2009, Congress passed legislation to grant gay individuals protection under hate crime laws. In 2012, California bans conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is therapy, so-called, I guess, to try to convert someone from being gay to not being gay. Generally, it's aimed at, well, I think of gay men, but I guess it also could be gay women. And it is not very successful. In some ways, this is unfortunate because some people really don't want to be gay. And in fact, that's typically the first response that people have. Is that they're like, I don't want this. This is not me. This is not what I want to be a part of. And so conversion therapy, sometimes people kind of enroll themselves. Oftentimes it has religious undertones to it, but I suppose maybe not always. But unfortunately, it does not work very much. I guess occasionally it does work. Everything works a little bit. But there are other times when it's a complete failure, like people end up killing themselves after doing conversion therapy, and again, generally it fails. They're trying to take away desire for the same sex and replace it with desire for the other sex, and then it almost, again, I guess I don't say it never works, but I know people who have converted, but I guess I would say that that the people who have started these things, like there's a famous one, Exodus International, the founder actually came out and said, I'm gay and I'm going to stay gay, and this thing that I created, it doesn't work, and stuff like that. So California bans it because they feel that it's dangerous. I'm sure that it is legal in other places, but I feel like it's kind of fallen out of favor because I think that the general consensus today is that it's a dangerous thing to do, because if somebody is like, I want to convert, and they go through this therapy and then it's supposed to work. Everyone else seems to be doing great, seems to be converted, and they're not. There's a feeling of like helplessness and failure, and they probably already deal with a lot of feelings of failure. And so sometimes that leads to people taking their own lives. So I think it was Bill Clinton, but it might have been George Bush, passed a Defense of Marriage Act. And what this did was it allowed states to pass laws banning same-sex marriage. And that held until 2013. And you might think, well, if people were allowed to, say, get married in some states but not in others, why wouldn't they just go to the states where they are allowed to get married and do it there? But under the Defense of Marriage Act, a couple of things happen. One is that when the state says that these people are not worthy of being included, a lot of times discrimination toward those groups happens. This is the issue with a leader standing up and calling out a certain group as bad or something like that. It's that they themselves may not mean any ill will or violence or discrimination toward that group, right? We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But oftentimes people who hear them, they hear it as license to treat that group poorly. And that could be everything from not giving them a job to, starting, like taking something that's theirs and starting it on fire or killing them or something, something like that. So what is the big deal with marriage? A lot of times people say, oh, it's just a piece of paper, who needs it anyway? But there are certain privileges that come with being married, and those are things related to adoption, custody, guardianship, and inheritance. And so those things were not allowed for people who were gay and lesbian up until 2015, when states said, the Supreme Court said that states could not keep same-sex couples from marrying in their states, and it must recognize the unions that come from other places. Because in 2013, 2 years earlier, they found that the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional. Let's talk about employment. 1 in 4 gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender individuals, or employees rather, experience employment discrimination in the past 5 years, right? And so oftentimes they find that it is harder to get a job, harder to stay in that job, harder to form working relationships, harder to get promoted, things like that. There is currently no federal law that protects these individuals from employment discrimination. So that means that a boss could say, I'm not giving you the job, or I'm not giving you the promotion because you're gay. Or they may probably more likely say something like, well, the clients are complaining because you're gay and they don't want to work with somebody who's gay, or something like that. So professional sports has very few people who identify as gay publicly. That's why they're referred to as the last closet, meaning many people in the sports world are not out of the closet. They are probably gay, but not talking about it publicly. So what does that do? I mean, it's their personal business, right? They can choose to tell the world or not tell the world. True. This other side of that coin is that it kind of gives license to other people who are involved to discriminate against people who are a member of that group, right? The military used to have a policy in which people were asked not to talk about their sexual orientation, and the military didn't ask. Don't ask, don't tell. We're not going to ask you what your orientation is. Don't tell us your orientation. And if you do tell us your orientation, then you could be discharged. That ended in 2011. So what else could be done to help people of this group? Well, there's currently no protection around a creditor, a banker, a car salesman, someone related to lending money, denying them credit, denying them the money based upon their sexual orientation. There's not protections for students, and there's no protection against public harassment or discrimination. And lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender youth are overrepresented in the foster care system. Why would they be overrepresented in the foster care system? Well, I'd have to imagine that the reason this would occur would be because they are not being adopted because of their sexual orientation, or they are having conflicts with people in their homes because of their orientation, which may leading to runaways, or may leading to the parents not wanting to be their parents. And so that's unfortunate, because the foster care system is a tough place to be. By the way, hats off to foster care parents. One day I'd love to be one if I could find the courage and strength to do that, because it's a really needed job, and it's really a tough job though. And yeah, there's more of them in that system than there should be. So like if there's, say, 4% of these youth are in, like in the population, well, maybe there's 6 or 7% in the foster care system. So, all right, well, that is the end of my lecture here.